Imagine this, you wake up tomorrow, check your bank account, and you have an extra $10,000 in there. Free money, no work required. Sounds like a dream, right? But now what if everyone got that same $10,000? What happens next? Prices skyrocket, your grocery bill doubles, and suddenly that extra cash means nothing. That's the hidden trap behind simply printing more money to solve economic problems. It doesn't actually create more wealth, it just spreads the same amount of value more thinly. Most people assume that when the economy struggles, if people just had more cash, they could spend it on more stuff, businesses would make more profit, and the economy would grow. Sounds great, right? Well, not quite, because if it were that easy, we'd all be millionaires by now. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Printing more money doesn't make a country richer. It just makes everything more expensive. And the moment you realize this, you start seeing why financial crises, inflation, and entire economies collapsing have one thing in common. Governments trying to take the easy way out. I've seen this play out firsthand in countries across the world. I've traveled to over 100 countries, some of them during or shortly after an economic crisis, and I've seen that some of the worst economic disasters weren't caused by a lack of money. Quite the opposite, they were caused by governments flooding their economies with it. From Zimbabwe's trillion-dollar bills to Venezuela's skyrocketing food prices, in this video, we're breaking down why printing money isn't the magic fix it seems to be, but more importantly, we'll explore the real solution that actually creates wealth. So let's dive in. If printing money actually worked, why do economies collapse when they try it? Why isn't every country just flooding the system with cash to make everyone rich? The short answer is quite simple. Money itself isn't wealth. It's just a tool to measure value. That's why if the government starts printing more money and just gives it to the population, people don't have more spending power. I'll illustrate that in just a second. Because the problem is that money only has value because of what it can buy. And when you suddenly inject a massive amount of money into your economy, businesses react by raising their prices. Why? Because if everyone has more money now, but there's still the same amount of goods and services, the only thing that changes is how much everything costs. This is inflation, and it erodes the purchasing power of every dollar you have. A real-world example is Zimbabwe in the early 2000s. The government printed so much money that prices started doubling every few hours. At its peak, Zimbabwe had a $100 trillion bill that couldn't even buy a loaf of bread. More recently, Argentina and Venezuela have struggled with the same issue, where extreme money printing led to hyperinflation, wiping out savings, making everyday goods unaffordable and leaving people poorer than before. But why do governments print money then? It's not like they don't know about the fact that it leads to inflation. Well, governments don't print money out of ignorance. They do it because in the short term, it does solve liquidity problems. When a country is drowning in debt, facing economic collapse, or trying to fund massive spending programs, printing money is often the easiest way to cover these expenses without raising taxes or cutting expenses, both of which are politically very unpopular. In places like Zimbabwe and Argentina, governments turn to money printing to pay off debts and also to fund social programs, but that only made things worse. Even in the US, massive money printing in 2020 was a response to economic shutdowns, providing stimulus checks and business bailouts to prevent a total crash. Now, the problem is that short-term fixes can create long-term pain, and once inflation kicks in, reversing the damage becomes incredibly difficult. So the takeaway here is that printing money doesn't increase wealth, it just raises prices. And as already mentioned, if you think this only happens in developing countries, think again. Even the US saw this effect when it massively increased its money supply in 2020, so prices shot up across the board and suddenly everyday people found themselves struggling to even afford the basic needs. So if printing money doesn't work, what actually does? Well, the key isn't making more money, it's making more value. And I'll go into that in more detail in just a minute, because the real secret to a thriving economy isn't just pushing more money into the system, it's making sure that the cash is backed by real growth. So let's talk about something that's very important to understand first. If printing money were the solution, poverty just wouldn't exist. Every government could just hand out stacks of cash and we'd all be rich, right? But we now know that's not how it works. Despite how tempting the idea sounds, history has shown time and time again that simply creating more money doesn't create more wealth. It just devalues the currency and makes everything more expensive. So here's where most people get it wrong. They think money itself holds real value, but money is just a tool, a representation of all the value created in an economy. Think of all the money in an economy as a big pie that represents the total wealth of the economy. And every dollar is just one slice of that pie. If you now print more dollars without increasing the total wealth, you're not making the pie bigger, you're cutting it into more slices. And when, in the analogy, each slice gets smaller, every dollar buys you less than before. Imagine playing Monopoly and suddenly everyone gets an extra $10,000. At first you'd feel great, but then property prices would skyrocket. That's exactly what happens in real life, except instead of Monopoly money, it's your salary, your savings, and your real cost of living that takes the hit. And here's the part that most people don't even realize. The people that benefit the most from newly printed money are very, very rarely the average citizens. Because the government distributes it through banks, corporations, and financial systems first. So by the time it reaches regular people, the prices have already gone up. That is, of course, if it doesn't happen through stimulus checks like it did in the US in 2020. This means that the people who own assets like stocks and real estate, for example, get richer, while everyone who has cash savings struggles with rising costs. So instead of fixing the economy, printing money actually deepens inequality. Let's talk about another point that sounds great at first, but hurts the very people it's supposed to help. Minimum wage. Raising the minimum wage sounds like an obvious way to help low-income workers, right? If people earn more per hour, they can afford a better life. But here's the problem. When minimum wages are set too high, they often end up hurting the very people they were meant to help. And here's why. Wages aren't just random numbers. They represent the value of the work being done. If you as a business owner need help with a task, that help of the new employee is worth a certain amount of money to you. So if a company is now forced by law to pay the employee more than what their work produces in value, they won't just absorb the cost out of generosity. They'll either raise prices, cut jobs, or replace workers with automation. I mean, think about it this way. If a small cafe has 3 employees earning $10 an hour and the minimum wage suddenly jumps to 20, just as an example, their labor cost just doubled overnight. But their profits, which they need to pay the employees, didn't. So what do? They either raise coffee prices, hurting consumers who will then end up buying less coffee, hurting the business again, or they cut staff, which hurts the workers, or they replace cashiers with self-service machines, which also hurts jobs and also maybe consumers because of the poorer experience. This is exactly what happened in places like California, where aggressive minimum wage hikes led to fast food chains reducing staff and replacing cashiers with kiosks. It's also why many businesses in Europe shift towards automation when labor costs rise too fast. The results are fewer jobs in low-wage industries, fewer opportunities, and higher costs for everyone. And the irony is that when wages rise artificially, inflation often follows. Businesses pass the labor costs onto consumers, meaning the very workers who got the pay raise now also have to pay more for everything. And if then inflation outpaces their pay increase, they're actually now worse off than before. Now, to be clear, I'm not against having a minimum wage altogether. There are many legitimate reasons for it, like avoiding the exploitation of vulnerable worker groups who might otherwise be forced to accept unfairly low wages. A well-balanced minimum wage ensures that workers are compensated fairly without distorting the job market or making it too expensive for businesses to hire workers. So the key question is not whether a minimum wage should exist, but at what level it actually helps rather than hurts. If it's set too low, it doesn't protect workers, and if it's set too high, it destroys jobs and drives inflation. So the challenge, as always, is finding the right balance. So while a reasonable minimum wage is important, setting it too high too fast can actually backfire. It could price workers out of jobs and make life more expensive for everyone. If you want to see what happens when governments completely ignore the dangers of printing money, just look at Venezuela and Zimbabwe, two of the most extreme cases of hyperinflation in modern history. Their stories are terrifying proof of what happens when money becomes completely detached from real economic value. Venezuela was once one of the richest countries in South America, thanks to its massive oil reserves. But instead of using this wealth to build a strong and diversified economy, the government relied almost entirely on oil exports to fund public spending. When oil prices then crashed in the 2010s, the government had two choices: cut spending or print money, and they chose the latter. To cover expenses, they flooded the economy with newly printed bolívares. The result? Well, hyperinflation skyrocketed to over 1,000,000% in 2018. As a reference, central banks usually target a rate of around 2% per year. That means prices were doubling every few weeks, and people went from buying groceries with cash to needing wheelbarrows full of bills just to buy bread. Eventually, the Venezuelan bolívar became so worthless that people actually started using the US dollar instead, or even bartering for goods instead of relying on their own currency. And if you think Venezuela's example is extreme, Zimbabwe took it even further. In the early 2000s, the government decided to fund massive government programs by printing money non-stop. They printed so much that inflation peaked at 89.76 trillion% per month. That's this number right here. Completely absurd. The Zimbabwean dollar became so worthless that the government had to issue a $100 trillion bill. Yes, you heard that right. A bill like this, which you even might have seen in a few memes before. It's real. And yet, it could barely buy a loaf of bread. I actually also have a $50 billion bill laying around here somewhere from when I went to Zimbabwe. But eventually, Zimbabwe had to completely abandon its own currency and switch to foreign currencies. So now, in practice, they use the US dollar over there, and you can buy these silly, huge bills from street vendors on the street, selling them as souvenirs for a couple of bucks. So these two cases show us something huge. Money only works when it represents real value. If governments keep printing more without actually increasing the goods, services, or productivity, all it does is make every existing dollar worth less. And the scary thing is that while Venezuela and Zimbabwe are the extreme examples, the same process happens everywhere on a smaller scale when governments print too much money. So if we now come back to this analogy that all the money in an economy is this giant pie split into slices, and if you're printing more dollars without actually increasing the wealth, you're just cutting the pie into more and smaller slices, the question that arises is, how do we make the pie bigger? Countries that actually become wealthier don't do it by printing money. They do it by increasing their productivity. This can mean technology and innovation. This means creating better ways to produce or distribute goods. A country could create a skilled workforce, so educating and training people to be able to do higher value jobs. Or a country could also increase their productivity through investments in infrastructure. So they could build roads, build factories, and implement technologies that enable more production. A perfect example of this are Germany and Japan after World War II. Both countries had their economies devastated by war, but they didn't print endless money to recover. Instead, they rebuilt by focusing on high-value industries, efficient production, and education. And today, they're both among the strongest economies in the world, not because they printed more money, but because they produced more value. So a country's value is not determined by how much money is in circulation. It's determined by how much useful value that money represents. That's why two countries can have the same amount of total money, but two completely different standards of living, because one is actually producing wealth and the other one is just inflating prices. The bottom line is that if governments really want to make people richer long-term, they don't need to print more money. They need to create the conditions for more productivity. And that's the only path to long-term prosperity. But what can you do with this knowledge now? Because understanding inflation and economic growth isn't just theory. It affects your personal finances, your savings, and your future. If you take action now by learning how money actually works, you can protect yourself from bad economic policies, make smarter financial decisions, and even build real wealth over time. And the worst thing you can do is ignore it. So if you really want to understand how to protect your wealth and build a financial foundation for yourself, watch my video on why saving your first $10,000 changes everything. Because what we've talked about here is hard to put into practice if you don't first have a strategy for growing your savings and assets. So click here to check it out, and thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you on the other side.